Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Transportation Society on transport economics, which will look at how have changes in travel patterns post-pandemic changed the economics of transport projects. The speaker today will be John Siraut. John is the Director of Transport Economics at Forestry Insight and is an economist specialised in the wider economic and social impacts of transport. John has worked on the HS2, Silvertown Tunnel, Crossrail, Heathrow, London Gateway Port, as well as light rail and tram schemes and buses and roads and parking. So I'll hand you over now to John to start his presentation.
Thanks so much, Alan, and good afternoon, everyone. And I've also worked on Dublin Metrolink and a few other projects in Ireland as well. So Fortier Insight, you won't have heard of because it was only just launched on Monday, but it's part of the RSK company group, which has a number of offices and presence in Ireland. But we are an economics consultancy practice and provide economic advice across a whole range of sectors of the economy. So what I want to do this afternoon is to go through some of the changes we've seen in transport across various modes, both in Ireland and more sort of generally comparing with the UK as well. And then just very briefly looking at how that then impacts on some transport schemes, given the changing travel patterns that we're seeing. So just to put things in context about the amount of travel that we actually do. So this looks at annual transport use, kilometers per person in 2023, when many economies were still coming out of COVID, but the picture hasn't changed much since then. And it compares Ireland against similar sized countries or similar size wealth of economy, plus also the United Kingdom. And obviously the biggest way of getting around is by car, and that sort of dominates transport in all the countries. And the level of travel within Ireland is comparable with other European countries. If we just look at public transport use, though, we see a slightly different picture. So bus, coach and tram use in Ireland is very high compared to most similar sized European countries. And that includes places like Luxembourg, which provides free public transport within its borders. So I found that interesting and a bit unusual. Maybe it's because of the amount of intercity coach services in Ireland, but it still seems very high compared to sort of comparator countries. And if we look at public transport use across countries which are regarded as having fantastic public transport, Switzerland, for example, is always highly rated as having a fully integrated public transport system. We find that Ireland's public transport use per person is broadly comparable, which I must confess came a bit of a surprise to me, slightly unusual. And countries like the Netherlands, which has an outstanding rail network, for example, Belgium and Denmark, again, have good rail networks. Their public transport use is quite a bit lower than Ireland's. So looking now at the sort of each individual modes, having sort of painted that overarching picture of transport use. So this slide shows you how number of air passengers has changed through the main Irish airports for the first 4 months of this year compared to the first 4 months of 2019 pre-pandemic. And what we see is this very large increase in passenger throughput at Cork and Shannon, less so at Dublin, given the sort of capacity constraints at Dublin Airport, and Kerry and Knock are sort of halfway between the two. And this sort of replicates the situation in many other locations, a massive increase in air passenger numbers post-pandemic. And if we look at the numbers travelling between Ireland and the UK, we see some interesting changes that are occurring. So the top half of this table shows the number of passengers travelling in 2019 between the Irish airports and the main UK airports, and then in 2024. And in the 2024 figures, those that are in red are where numbers have actually fallen. So from the previous slide, we saw that the number of air passengers flying in and out of Irish airports have increased quite substantially. But if you look at flights to and from the UK, we see some quite significant falls. So for example, the number of people travelling between Dublin and London has fallen by well over 500,000. About 10% reduction between 2019 and 2024. And again, the same between Dublin and Birmingham. And even other airports links to London have fallen, so Cork and Kerry have also seen reductions in the number of people travelling to London. And potentially a number of reasons for this. So one is a fall in business travel. We'll probably like to see more business passengers traveling between Dublin and London. And we've seen falls in business travel, but also the links between Ireland and the UK have slightly diminished following Brexit and the change in outlook of both countries and the links between the two. The data here is from the UK Civil Aviation Authority, who regularly survey passengers at airports to understand the reasons why they're travelling and whether that varies whether they are based in the UK or whether they are foreign residents. And what we see, the difference here between 2019 and 2024 is quite stark. So we see a big reduction in the number of people travelling for international business, both UK nationals and foreign residents. And in the UK context, what we've seen is a bigger fall in foreign residents than UK residents in international business. Again, probably partly to do with Brexit, but also a change in business travel that we've seen. So people have moved away from physical interactions to moving online, just as we are here. On international leisure, again, we've seen a fall in foreign international leisure passengers, but a big increase in UK international leisure passengers. And across domestic business and leisure traffic, the same patterns are arising. So what we're seeing is this big increase in outbound leisure travel and a fall in international leisure travel and a big fall in international business travel, both the UK and foreign. And this is sort of replicated as well as Ireland, because what we've seen in Ireland is the trade balance, the balance between spend by foreigners visiting Ireland and Irish people spending overseas has increased quite significantly. And Ireland, like the UK, now has a deficit on tourism revenues. So what we've seen post-COVID is aviation travel for leisure passengers increasing, but for business travel, it's actually fallen quite a lot. And that has implications for things like the campaigns to expand capacity at Dublin Airport. Is that actually an economic benefit to Ireland, or are we just benefiting the Mediterranean economies where people can spend their money in Spain or Greece rather than maybe domestically? If we look at international road freight, again, we see sort of interesting patterns happening, which again are sort of linked into Brexit. So this slide shows loaded road trailers, both inbound and outbound, at Dublin and Rosslare. And what we've seen is, after the hiccup caused by COVID, a significant fall in the amount of traffic going through Dublin. And that is, again, heavily linked into Brexit. So hauliers travelling between Ireland and continental Europe are now no longer travelling through the UK as much. And also traffic from the UK to Northern Ireland, which often used to pass through Dublin, going north is no longer doing so. It's going only keeping into UK ports. And what we're seeing at Rosslare is those additional direct ferry services which have been provided from Ireland to continental Europe have meant the amount of traffic going through Rosslare has increased, but it doesn't balance out the decrease in traffic going through Dublin, and that is possibly down to that link going to and from Northern Ireland. So again, we're seeing sort of impacts of traffic, partly due to political reasons, as well as economic reasons. And if we look at passenger numbers on the Irish Sea to and from the UK, again, we see a continuation of a sort of steady decline in passenger numbers travelling by ferry, and a sort of diminution of anywhere but Holyhead. So the three ports that used to provide direct services to Ireland, Fishguard, Pembroke and Liverpool, they've seen traffic levels fall by half, and Liverpool no longer has those sorts of direct passenger services to Dublin anymore. So we're seeing, again, changes happening in the economy, but also changes happening for political reasons. Moving on to what's happening domestically on the road networks. So this slide shows what's happening on the M50 on a random Wednesday in early November, and compares 2019 to 2025. And what we see is that in up until the 6 o'clock in the morning, the patterns are identical between 2019 and 2025. But what we then see is a reduction in the number of car traffic in 2025 compared to 2019 in the peak period. So between sort of 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock, there's a marked difference between the 2 years. And this is driven in part by the massive increase we've seen in working from home. So we've seen a diminution in peak hour traffic. Off-peak traffic is slightly higher than in 2019. And again, in the evening peak, what we're seeing is broadly the same sort of traffic levels. A slight, I'm not sure whether the 2019 was a blip at 5 o'clock and maybe an issue, an accident or something, as the number seems a bit skewed. But generally what we're seeing, and we see it elsewhere, we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, is that the amount of traffic in the early morning commute is actually diminished quite a bit compared to 2019. For LGVs, the two lines at the bottom of the chart, what we're seeing is a slight increase in LGV traffic in 2025 compared to 2019. And again, all that home shopping has led to a big increase in the amount of LGV traffic on the road networks. A slightly different picture emerges when we look at the N20 between Cork and Limerick. Here we see virtually identical traffic patterns in the morning peak between 2019 and 2025. So this was a random Monday, mid-October, avoiding the bank holiday period. And again, what we're seeing is a slightly bringing forward the evening peak in 2025. So traffic volumes are slightly higher than they were in 2019 and sort of run up to 4 o'clock. And then between sort of 4 and 6, we've seen a slight reduction compared to 2019 and 2025. So potentially a change in working patterns. But it's interesting that in the morning peak on this particular road, there's been no variation between 2019 and 2025. And again, if we look at the M7 eastbound, so this is going into Dublin. So this was last week, looking at traffic levels on each of the weekdays. Again, what we see is a slight dip on a Friday morning peak, fewer people traveling on a Friday morning compared to the other 4 days of the week. But interesting that Monday actually is the peak day. Maybe that's people coming back from the weekend out of Dublin, coming back into Dublin. But definitely a reduction in traffic on a Friday morning. And again, what we see sort of mid-afternoon is then Friday traffic levels increasing above the rest of the week as people start their getaway, maybe for the weekend, or actually people coming into Dublin for evening activities. So again, pre-COVID, we were seeing much more even traffic patterns across the 5 days of the week. Post-COVID, we're seeing that definite, in Ireland, a definitely marked reduction in Friday traffic compared to other weekdays. What about public transport use? Well, what we're showing here is a 4-week moving average based on the weeks 2 to 5 in 2020, so avoiding the first week of 2020 and the New Year's holiday period. So it's looking at how traffic has changed, or how use of the public transport system has changed from that initial period of 2020. And what we see is a very different picture in Ireland compared to the UK. So bus use outside Dublin, we see a substantial increase in patronage, way above pre-COVID levels, and that has sort of been consistent and growing, maybe down to improvements in the bus network. But that is certainly a very different picture than in the UK, where we've seen bus usage fall and has not recovered to pre-COVID levels. Then in Dublin, we see the Dublin buses and Lewis basically following virtually identical patterns. And again, we've seen significant increases in patronage compared to pre-COVID. And again, very different to the UK. If we compare Dublin to London, London is seeing public transport use down by about 20% compared to pre-COVID levels. In Dublin, you're seeing a substantial increase above pre-COVID levels. And then on rail, which is more likely to be used by office workers and longer distance commuters, we've seen rail effectively get back to pre-COVID levels. It's taken a bit longer than the other modes of public transport, but it's getting there. And that sort of more marries the situation in the UK, where rail usage again is still below pre-COVID levels. And if we look at different parts of the rail network, so obviously some issues about the autumn station census data, but this is comparing 2019 to 2024 for Dublin and for Cork, Limerick and Galway. And what we see on DART is a slight reduction in 2024 compared to 2019. Again, likely to be caused by reduction in people commuting into work. The commuter lines basically are the same as they were in 2019, possibly reflecting improved services. Well, the intercity services have increased, so the number of people using intercity services has increased quite markedly, and that sort of feeds through into increased patronage at Cork, Limerick and Galway. And again, this is a sort of pattern we've seen elsewhere, is that leisure traffic, just like aviation leisure traffic has rebounded post-COVID, rail leisure traffic has also rebounded quite significantly post-COVID. And we're seeing in, I don't have the data for Ireland, but certainly in the UK, outside London, we see more people now traveling on a Saturday than they are traveling on the average weekday. So a change has occurred post-COVID, as people are traveling more for leisure and less for work and business. And this chart is a bit complicated to get your head around, but it shows the number of passengers traveling through London Underground stations, which serve the main rail termini in London, on a Monday, a Tuesday to Thursday, because we find in London Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursdays are virtually identical, on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And just want to highlight a few points on this chart, really. So Cannon Street Station serves the City of London, so the main office centre within London. Around 600,000 people work in the City of London, and Cannon Street is one of the major stations serving that area. And what we've seen here is a massive reduction in the number of passengers using Cannon Street Station. So on a Tuesday to Thursday, it's down by more than 30%. On a Monday, it's down by about 40%. And on a Friday, it's down by 50%. And this reflects the massive change in working patterns that we've seen in London, especially. That Tuesday to Thursdays are the busiest days of the week. Mondays less so, and Fridays can be quite dead. But what we see, and looking at other stations such as Euston and Moorgate and Liverpool Street, we see large increase in passenger numbers on Saturdays and Sundays. So again, what we're seeing is this switch from a commuter railway to more of a leisure-based railway. And that has implications, as we'll come on later, to talk about how we analyse projects, major infrastructure schemes, and what the impacts of the change in travel patterns have been having. But we've seen this large-scale reduction, especially on a Friday, of commuters coming in to central London, and an increase in passengers at many locations at the weekends. Another interesting thing that has changed over a sort of longer period of time, not just a COVID-related issue, but is the Irish Centres has some interesting data about asking people what time do you start out for work. And on the chart here, we shows the different times that people start, before 6:30 to after 9:30, and then by male and females. And what we see is that, to take the sort of 6:30 to 7 o'clock period, for example, the number or the proportion of people traveling to work who travel at that time has increased substantially for both men and women. So for women, it was about 7% back in 2011. By 2022, that number had increased about 12%. For men, the number had increased from probably something like 12% to 20%. And so what we're seeing across those early morning time bands is people starting off for their trip to work earlier and earlier in the morning. And that follows through to the later periods, so between 8:31 and 9 o'clock, where, as in 2011, 20% of women were starting off to work at that time. That has fallen now to around 13%. And for males, it's gone from about 12% down to about 8%. So what we're seeing is people starting traveling off to work earlier than previously. And that's possibly due to trying to avoid congestion, or having longer commutes than in the past. So some major significant changes happening about when people are traveling on the network. And how they're traveling, for women certainly has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. So back in 1981, almost as many women walked to work as drove themselves to work, and that has changed dramatically now. 70% of women now drive themselves to work. And we've seen a massive decline in the number of people walking to work and traveling by bus to work. Not so marked for men. Here we see an increase in the number of men driving to work, but only from about 60% to 70% over the last 40 years. And again, a reduction in walking to work. And if we look at those sustainable modes in a bit more detail for both men and women, so we see that very marked pattern of reduction in women cycling, going by bus, traveling on foot, and as a passenger in a car. But the one area that has seen an increase is by train. And for men, again, bicycle use has stayed fairly constant. Bus use has declined a bit. Foot has declined quite a lot. But again, train has increased. And so we're seeing that it's a sort of indication that people are traveling further to work and traveling longer distances. And that has resulted in changes of mode from those more sustainable modes, shorter distances to work, to traveling much longer, and therefore using either train or car to a much greater extent than in the past. So again, it has changing implications for transport strategy going forward. This comes from the English National Travel Survey, but I'm sure we see the same pattern in Ireland. And it shows sort of fundamental changes in both the number of trips we make and the reasons why we make trips. And sometimes we forget that transport is a derived demand. People don't travel just for the sake of traveling. They travel for particular reasons. And so what this chart shows is the reduction or the increase in the number of trips made for particular purposes. So the dark blue is commuting travel, and across both men and women and across all age groups except one, we've seen a marked reduction in the number of trips made for commuting purposes. The only exception to that is for women aged between 60 to 69. And in the UK, we've seen an increase in the state retirement age, which has led to more women entering the workforce post 60, and has therefore driven that slight increase in the number of commuting trips made by women over the age of 60. We've seen changes in the number of trips made for escort education, so taking your children to school, a school run. So again, working from home and changes in cultural expectations has seen an increase in the number of males who make those school trip journeys, and a reduction for younger women and an increase in older women, which again relates to changing age of family formation, bringing in grandparents to do those school trips for people as well. So again, although the number of trips overall hasn't really changed, the balance of who's making those trips for the school run has changed. Shopping trips have fallen dramatically across all age groups, and especially amongst women, as we've moved to online shopping. More women in the workforce has resulted in a reduction in shopping trips. And perhaps the most disheartening is the reduction in number of trips made for visiting friends, especially amongst younger people. We're moving from a physical environment to a digital environment. And by 2024, travel patterns have sort of stabilized post-COVID. So this is not really purely down to COVID, but it's a changing how we socialize. We're not making as many trips for social purposes. We are making more leisure trips, and across all age groups and both genders, we are increasing the number of trips we make for walking, which is a positive. And maybe the only reason why people get out of the house, given their reduction in journey purposes for other uses. So overall, what we're seeing is a reduction in the number of trips people are making, and a much larger change in the reasons why they're making those trips. And again, that has sort of implications going forward. What I just now want to sort of touch upon is how do all these changes impact on the types of schemes that we bring forward for appraisal purposes for developing schemes. So we have here 3 different types of scheme, A, B, C, and these are sort of mixed between all 3 of them. So A, you might think of in a UK context as being something like high-speed rail, which is geared up very heavily for business use. And therefore, most of the benefits which are in black in this table are the benefits that accrue to business users. And these are sort of time savings, which are the biggest benefits that we have in transport schemes. It's less used by commuting and less used by leisure travel. Scheme B might be thought of as maybe a bus improvement or light rapid transit scheme, which is mainly aimed at commuters within a sort of an urban setting. And so most of the benefits are accruing to commuters traveling at times of heavy congestion, which we're relieving by providing a better service for them. And C is a scheme that's maybe serving principally a leisure destination. So maybe a seaside resort of a type of leisure destination, relatively little commuting traffic and relatively little business travel. Most of it is commuting. And D sort of brings those 3 types of schemes together and says, what happens if we have a scheme where all the benefits are equal between commuting, other, and business? And these numbers you can think of as being in millions of euros or whatever unit that you want to use. The numbers don't really matter much. But what we're trying to show is that the benefits across each of these schemes is identical. The costs are all identical. And therefore, the net present value, the NPV, is the same across all schemes. That's the difference between the benefits minus the costs. And the benefit cost ratio, benefits divided by costs, are the same for all the schemes. So you have these schemes that might come forward before COVID. They all show the same sort of benefits. And they're all aiming at different types of segments of the market. So A is aimed at a business segment, B is mainly for commuting, and C is more of a leisure type intervention. So what has happened given the changes that we've seen in travel behavior due to the pandemic? So one, we've seen a big reduction in business travel, about a 27% reduction in business travel across virtually all modes of transport. And therefore, those business benefits reduce quite significantly. We've seen a reduction in commuting benefits if you spread them over the working week of around 19%. And for leisure purposes, we've only seen a very small reduction. In some cases, we've seen an increase. Others, we've seen a reduction. And in this example, we're assuming a sort of 2% reduction in benefits for other purposes. And what we start seeing is when we look at the bottom line, the benefit cost ratios, we start seeing a differentiation between schemes. Before, all those schemes gave you the same benefit cost ratio. Now we're seeing schemes which are aimed at either the business or commuting market, giving you a slightly different and a lower benefit cost ratio than schemes aimed at the leisure market. We've also seen a change in the commuting mix, and the values of time we use for commuting are based on sort of average earnings. But what we've seen is higher income individuals working from home more, and therefore that change in commuting mix effectively reduces the values of time that we should use for commuting. So again, we start seeing changes in the types of schemes and the benefits that they bring. And finally, what we've seen is a large increase in construction inflation. And so here we're seeing a 15% increase in costs, and that's led to actually some schemes very breaking even compared to what they were previously. And to sort of summarize this, bring this all together. So we had 4 schemes, or 3 schemes effectively. One is just an amalgamation more. So A is a scheme aimed at supporting business travel. And we've seen that go from a fairly healthy pre-pandemic BCR 1.5 down to just 1. We've seen scheme B, which was aimed at sort of addressing a commuting issue. And again, that's gone from 1.5 to 1. And only the sort of scheme which is aimed for leisure users is still showing a sort of more positive mix. And it shows you in a very simple way that actually the types of schemes that should be coming forward in the future are not going to be the same sort of schemes that we're bringing forward in the past. This reduction in business travel, the reduction in commuting patterns that we're seeing, actually means that those types of interventions are possibly not giving you the same sort of benefits that they did in the past. And because we're seeing lots of travel for leisure purposes, then maybe those types of schemes that serve more of a leisure market are the types of schemes that we need to be considering based on the changes of journey patterns that we've experienced since COVID. So that was a very quick overview of changes in use of transport across the network, both in Ireland and in a wider perspective, and what some of these, in very simple terms, those implications might be. For those of you who like data and analysis of data, the QR code gives you a link to my LinkedIn page, and I regularly blog about changes in transport using the latest statistics covering both the UK, Ireland, and a wider field, as well as some more general economics blogs as well. So you're more than welcome to follow me on LinkedIn and to access those insights that I provide there. And that's it from me. So I think we move over to the Q&A session now.